Dear viewers, let us learn about carbohydrate. Carbohydrates means sugar or polymers of sugars such as starch. These polymers on hydrolysis yield simple sugars through the action of digestive enzymes or by heating with dilute acids. Carbohydrates are the major source of energy in human diets. Earlier, they were just considered as means of obtaining energy, but now it is recognized as an important food component with many physiological effects. These physiological effects associated with dietary carbohydrates depends on the rate and extent of their digestion. Digestion and absorption takes place in the small intestine and fermentation in the large intestine. Glycogen is the storage polysaccharide and is deposited in liver and skeletal muscles. It is structurally similar to starch. Glycogen is the storage polysaccharide from animal source. Through the action of digestive enzymes, carbohydrate breaks down to monosaccharides and gets absorbed by the small intestine. Few studies have indicated that the consumption of readily available sugar leads to an increase in plasma glucose level. This has been proven to be detrimental to the health. This session will cover the following aspects on carbohydrates: classification, functions, absorption and digestion, metabolism of carbohydrates, deficiency of carbohydrates, excess of carbohydrates. Let's learn about classification of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates have been classified into three major classes, namely monosaccharide, disaccharide and polysaccharides. Glucose, fructose, galactose and mannose are characterized as monosaccharides. The major disaccharides are sucrose, lactose and maltose. Polysaccharides generally include cellulose, hemicelluloses, pectins, gums and mucilages, which are largely regarded as insoluble fractions. Now, let us study each of these classifications in detail. Monosaccharides. These are the compounds which comprise simple sugars and cannot be further hydrolyzed to simpler compounds. Glucose, galactose and mannose are known as monosaccharides. Glucose is also referred to as dextrose. Glucose is the end product obtained after the digestion of disaccharide and polysaccharide. Glucose circulates in the blood and gets utilized by various cells in the body for energy. Fructose is normally known as fruit sugar, which is highly soluble, and the unique feature is that it does not readily crystallizes. It is found in honey, ripe fruits and certain vegetables. Fructose is also present in invert sugar, which is a syrup prepared from sucrose and used extensively in the food industry. Galactose is the hydrolyzed product of lactose, not found abundantly in nature. Other form of monosaccharide might be found in wider range in plant-based foods and are largely considered to be quantitatively insignificant. Let's learn about disaccharides. These are formed when two hexoses are combined along with loss of one molecule of water. Sucrose. Sucrose is a disaccharide of glucose and fructose. Table sugar is 99% pure sucrose and is found naturally in many fruits and vegetables. Commercial sucrose is extracted from sugar beet and sugarcane. It can be readily hydrolyzed to glucose and fructose by the action of acid and enzymes sucrase in the small intestine. Many fruits and vegetables contain small amount of sucrose. Let's learn about lactose. Lactose is the disaccharide of glucose and galactose, which occurs naturally in milk and milk products, and hence they are named milk sugar. Its solubility is comparatively lesser than other disaccharides. It can be readily hydrolyzed by the enzyme lactase. However, Individuals lacking these enzymes are prone to develop lactose intolerance. Its awareness potency is only 1/6 part of the glucose. It is the only carbohydrate which is synthesized by the mammals. Maltose. Maltose is an intermediate product produced during the hydrolysis of starch. It can be synthesized during malting and fermentation of grains. Beer and malted breakfast cereals are considered to have appreciable amounts. Commercial processed products are often prepared using maltose and are sold as sugar-free products. Dextrose. Dextrose is a glucose and is formed during hydrolysis of corn starch. Trehalose. It is a disaccharide of glucose. It is generally known as mushroom sugar since 15% of dry matter of mushroom comprises of trehalose. It is also present in insects. Let's learn about the functions of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates as a source of energy. Carbohydrates containing foods are the concentrated source of energy. 1 gram of carbohydrate on oxidation provides 4 kilocalories. As protein sparing action, when the diet comprises adequate amount of carbohydrates, it is used as source of energy and the available protein is used solely for tissue building. If the diet does not supply sufficient calories from the carbohydrates, the dietary protein tends to get oxidized and are utilized as a source of energy to carry out the physiological functions. Carbohydrates for oxidation of fats. Beta oxidation of fat takes place in the presence of adequate amount of carbohydrate. The acetyl CoA formed during the oxidation of fatty acids reacts with oxaloacetic acid formed from carbohydrate and the metabolism of amino acid. They react to form citric acid which gets oxidized through TCA cycle back to oxaloacetic acid. This mechanism is mediated by a series of reactions. These reactions get impaired in the absence of adequate carbohydrates. Consequently, impaired reaction leads to the accumulation of intermediary products of fat oxidation. This finally results to a condition termed as ketosis. Function of carbohydrate as source of energy for nervous system. Glucose is the primary source of energy for central nervous system. Prolonged hypoglycemic condition is known to cause irreversible damage to the brain tissues. Carbohydrate role in muscles. The major source of energy for muscular work is derived from the carbohydrates. During the process of muscle contractions, the glycolysis step breaks down glycogen to lactic acid. In the recovery stage, the lactic acid tends to undergo oxidation and yields pyruvic acid and acetyl CoA. This is further oxidized to carbon dioxide and water and thus produces energy for carrying out the muscular work. Carbohydrate role in the liver. One of the most important functions of the carbohydrate is the detoxifying action. Carbohydrate regulates the metabolism of proteins and fats. Liver serves as a storage site for glycogen. Liver resists the harmful effect of certain poisons such as carbon tetrachloride, alcohol, arsenic and certain bacterial toxins. Carbohydrate as the primary source of energy for heart muscle. Glucose is used as the main source of energy. In hypoglycemic conditions, a drastic change in the functioning of the heart can be seen. Carbohydrate as the source of synthesis of ribose. Ribose is found in RNA and in nucleotides. It is synthesized in the body through a process known as hexose monophosphate pathway. Functions of carbohydrates as storage. Excess of calories from the carbohydrates will be stored as fat in adipose tissues. Depending on the body needs, the stored fat would be mobilized for the energy purpose, for example, during illness, fasting, etc. Role of carbohydrates as the enhancement of gut microflora. Lactose sugars promotes the growth of desirable bacteria in the gastrointestinal tract. Some of them are considered highly beneficial for the synthesis of B complex vitamins. The process of glucose oxidation provides the carbon skeleton which is required for the synthesis of alanine, aspartic acid and glutamic acid. Carbohydrates are designated as one of the most important structural components of many organisms, particularly fiber fraction of plant, exoskeleton of some of the insects and cell wall of microorganisms. Let us learn about digestion of carbohydrates. Digestion of starch or carbohydrate begins in mouth by the enzyme alpha amylase. The partial hydrolysis of polysaccharide to dextrine and maltose takes place by pancreatic amylase. Maltose, sucrose and lactose gets hydrolyzed by maltase, sucrase and lactase present in the intestinal juice. Starch present in whole grains and seeds is thought to be physically inaccessible by pancreatic amylase. Size reduction techniques such as crushing, chopping and milling influences the accessibility of starch molecules. Gelatinization and dispersion of starch granule is the most important characteristic property of starch, and this particular mechanism is known to be facilitated by hydrolysis of starch. Starch from raw cereals digest at slower pace and are known to exert modest amount of glycemic response. Let us learn about absorption of carbohydrates. The bloodstream mainly absorbs glucose, galactose and fructose. Through the capillaries of the villi, simple sugars pass to the portal circulation. Further, they are transported to the liver where fructose and galactose would be converted to glycogen, the storage form of carbohydrate. The stored glycogen can be reconverted to glucose based on the requirement for the energy. Glucose and galactose are absorbed at a much faster rate than fructose, whereas pentoses are absorbed at a relatively slower rate. The total amount of sodium ions in the intestinal lumen is regarded as the major determinant of glucose absorption. The glucose influx into the intestinal mucosal cells is mediated by a high concentration of sodium ions, while the lower concentration tends to inhibit the glucose influx. This is mainly due to the fact that both glucose and sodium ions utilize same co-transporter carrier protein. The glucose transport mechanism also transports galactose. Fructose absorption mainly takes place through a carrier mediated diffusion system, and its absorption is not dependent on the concentration of sodium ions. Some fractions of fructose will be converted to glucose in the muscular cells. It has been estimated that about 97 to 98% of the integrated carbohydrate would be digested and absorbed. Let us learn about metabolism of carbohydrates. Glucose is oxidized with the help of enzyme to yield carbon dioxide, water and heat. The specified compounds like adenosine triphosphate or ATP is enzymatically broken down and releases energy as per the requirement. Through a series of steps, glucose is broken down into two molecules of pyruvate. This is further converted into acetyl coenzyme A, along with releasing small amount of ATP. In the next step, through a series of reaction, acetyl coenzyme A enters into TCA cycle. This in turn releases carbon dioxide and hydrogen atoms. These later enter into electron transport system and releases ATP. The complete oxidation process of one molecule of glucose yields 36 ATP molecules, 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 molecules of water. Let us try to understand the process of conversion of carbohydrate to glycogen. Consumption of excess carbohydrate through the diet is known to be converted into a reserve form of energy, which is known as glycogen. Both liver as well as muscle synthesize glycogen from the excess amount of glucose. Liver is capable of storing only limited amount of glycogen. When the need arises, the reserve store is quickly converted to glucose. The muscle can store 150 gram of glycogen and the liver stores about 90 gram, which mainly exercises control over blood sugar, and this mechanism is well regulated by hormones. The liver storage of glycogen can last only for about 12 to 18 hours of fasting. Let us learn about the factors affecting the absorption of carbohydrates. Absorption is totally dependent on the rate at which carbohydrate enters the small intestine. This depends on the mobility of the stomach, control of duodenal, sphincter muscle and the pyloric valve. The degree of competition for the absorption sites is thought to be dependent on the composition of the food and the existence of carrier systems. The condition of intestinal membrane and the total contact time of carbohydrate with the membrane is known to exert greater influence on the digestion process. Abnormalities in mucosal tissues and the rapid movement of carbohydrate in the intestine are known to hinder absorption. Normal endocrine activity and the other related functions of thyroid is the basic essentiality for normal absorption. The other factors such as the presence of intact plant cell walls and dense structure of starchy foods and the presence of proteins and fats have strong bearing on the absorbability of the carbohydrates. Increased meal frequency tend to slow down the rate of absorption in the small intestine. Let us learn the effect of deficiency of carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are the concentrated source of energy. The primary effect of carbohydrate deficiency causes malnutrition among children less than 5 years of age. Young children are more prone to develop energy deficiency. The clinical conditions such as kwashiorkor and marasmus are caused due to the continuous deficiency of proteins and calories. The major symptoms involves wasting of muscles due to starvation. Impaired growth is also noticed. Immune responses are known to be affected seriously in a child suffering from marasmus. The other conditions known as ketosis is associated with many other factors. Ketosis can also occur as a result of carbohydrate deficiency and is frequently reported in those individuals who are on low carbohydrate diets. In the absence of adequate amounts of carbohydrates, the body starts using the available proteins and convert it to sugars. This causes ketosis and the accumulation of ketones in the body can be seen. Excess ketones results in water loss and removal of sodium from the body. This may cause tiredness and lethargy. The major symptoms include fatigue, exercise intolerance, nausea, headache, dehydration and flu-like symptoms. Hypoglycemia, also known as low blood sugar or low blood glucose. This condition is seen when the glucose levels in the blood drops below the critical level. While hypoglycemia is often associated with diabetes, it can be caused by lack of carbohydrates in the diet of healthy people. Carbohydrates are the main source of glucose because they are broken down into carbohydrates are the main source of glucose because they are broken down into simple sugars during digestion and enter the cells with the help of insulin for further utilization by the cells. Symptoms of hypoglycemic includes tiredness, weakness, lightheadedness, confusion and hunger. Let's learn about the effects of excessive consumption of carbohydrates. Consuming excessive amounts of carbohydrates, especially those which are known to have glycemic load, can increase the risk of several disorders including type 2 diabetes. This can cause sudden rise in the blood glucose and high demand on pancreas for insulin secretion. This significantly increases the likelihood of development of type 2 diabetes. A diet containing too many carbohydrates can raise the blood level of triglyceride, a type of unhealthy fat that circulates in the blood. It can also lower the blood levels of high density lipoproteins. This alteration in the ratio of LDL to HDL could be considered as major determinant in diagnosing the cardiovascular diseases. The other effect observed due to the overconsumption of carbohydrates is obesity. Obesity is highly prevalent both among developed as well as developing countries. The combined effect of excessive carbohydrates intake coupled with sedentary lifestyle increases risk of obesity. This in turn causes several lifestyle related disorders such as diabetes, cardiovascular diseases, certain types of cancer. Recommended dietary allowances for carbohydrates. We are aware about the fact that excess carbohydrate is converted to fat and stored in adipose tissues. Hence, it has to be consumed only in sufficient quantities. The minimum recommendation for carbohydrate is 100 gram per day, which is very much needed for preventing ketosis. Our daily diet is known to contain much higher levels than this. A normal balanced diet should provide 60% calories from the carbohydrate. A 2000 kilocalorie diet should contain 275 to 300 grams of carbohydrate per day. About 10 grams should be obtained from the, about 100 calories should be obtained from sugar and the remaining should be from the complex carbohydrate sources. About the sources of carbohydrates. Whole grains are an excellent sources of complex carbohydrates and dietary fiber. Some grains that contain carbohydrates includes rice, corn, wheat, barley, oats and buckwheat. Whole grains like brown rice and whole grain wheat are the best sources of complex carbohydrates. The consumption of complex carbohydrates through whole grain is proven to be highly beneficial for maintaining the overall health. Most of the ready to eat cereals contain a good amount of sugar even though they claim to be whole grain. Legumes rank next in importance to cereals as good food sources. Just like grains and nuts, legumes are also rich in complex carbohydrates. They too are beneficial for regulating the blood glucose levels. Roots and tubers are another group of foods providing maximum amount of carbohydrates. Sweet potatoes provide simple amount of carbohydrates. An 8 ounce of sweet potato contains 240 calories and 55 gram of carbohydrates. Among the fruits, banana is the richest source of carbohydrates. Berries of different kinds like strawberries and blueberries are rich source of carbohydrates. The form of sugar present in them is simple sugar, so they are digested quickly and increases the level of blood sugar. The other sources like sugar, jaggery and honey are also known to contribute significant amount of carbohydrates. To conclude on carbohydrates, a carbohydrate is a chemical compound made up of hydrogen, carbon and oxygen. The basic unit of carbohydrate is monosaccharide. Carbohydrates are stored in the form of starch in plants and glycogen in animals. All digestible forms of carbohydrates are broken by the action of enzyme ptyalin in mouth. Further digestion and absorption continues by pancreatic and intestinal enzyme amylase and maltose to the simple sugars glucose. Adequate supply of carbohydrates determines the amount of fat to be metabolized for energy. Carbohydrates have an anti-ketogenic effect which prevents harmful excess of ketone accumulation in the body. On the other hand, excess of carbohydrates converts to fats as storage, causing obesity.